continue coming in. Good morning, everyone. How are you today? How's everyone doing? I've got a couple of thumbs up. Nice to see a few faces. I would love to see more if you're up for it. I know everybody's a little zoomed out, but we're definitely gonna hope that there will be a little bit of engagement in this training today, because it's no fun just being talked at for a few hours. So you have the pleasure of getting 3 of us for this training today. My name is Kati Brown, and I am the program supervisor for the Walla Walla Child Advocate Program. You will also be hearing from Jeannie Delaplane, who is with DCYF, so you're going to get her in-depth knowledge and perspective of resources and kinship stuff, as well as Luann Marshall, who is with the CARES program, and she is really one-on-one on the ground supporting our relatives. So I'm really excited to be able to share the stage with all of them. I'm going to go ahead and launch into some slides, but I would like to just throw it out there. If you have, we have a lot of time this morning, so there will be plenty of time. If you have questions, there'll be a couple opportunities, hopefully, to shout out some answers to things and to talk through stuff. So I'm hoping that you won't just sit there quietly, that you will be willing to unmute and join in the conversation or ask some questions. Let's see if I can get my slides going. Did that work? Did you see that? Okay, good. So again, I'm Kati Brown, and with me are Jeannie and Luann, and we're going to be talking about supporting kinship care. And I think you'll note from hearing from all 3 of us that it's just a huge passion of ours, and it really does bolster child well-being. It strengthens families, it promotes reunification. I think utilizing kinship is arguably one of the child welfare's best strategies for keeping kids safe and nurtured. And so we just want to talk to you about why that's so important to children and youth, and what are some of the services that are out there to support our families. I love this quote by Dr. Sarah Springer. She says, "Kinship caregivers play a critical role in helping traumatized children to heal. By maintaining ties to family, community, and culture, children are spared additional losses. Being sheltered in the loving arms of a familiar adult is an invaluable first step on the road to healing." So just a few of our goals for today. Again, we want to talk about why relatives are a preferred placement for children and youth, and then also what are the myriad of available supports for them. So we'll be going over the strengths and benefits of kinship care, understanding the unique needs and challenges faced by relatives. You're going to learn about financial resources available for our caregivers. Luann's going to introduce a new program with CARES that works directly with the caregivers to support them through licensure and key points and placement. And then if there's any investigations after placement. And I hope at the very least you'll walk away with some empathy for our relatives who are navigating this system and didn't ask to be part of a bureaucratic process. So I'm going to read to you 2 different perspectives from relatives that I've worked with, and just try to put yourself in their shoes and what this would be like to be a relative going about your day and you get a phone call and now you're starting to have to manage a system. So Grandma Jean shared with me, "I raised both of my kids without intervention or help from the state system. My oldest grandbaby just started college this year. Now the state is saying that my son and his girlfriend can't take care of their little 2-year-old, and they took them and placed him with me. Well, now the state's saying if I want some financial support, I have to go through some training. Well, what can they tell me about raising these kids? I've been taking care of them their whole life. Besides, how do they expect me to do this class while taking care of my grandbaby, taking him to appointments, visits, and maintaining a job?" So again, thinking about our relatives and trying to put ourselves in their shoes, this grandma had already raised grandkids before, and sometimes there's a little bit of a feeling of being insulted that now all of a sudden they have to jump through these hoops, and they're trying to balance their life with a new addition of family members. So that can be just a bit of a barrier, just even in chatting with them right off of the bat. So the next perspective is from great uncle Jared, and he was sharing, Jennifer is my great niece, and when the state called to tell me that her 2 kids had been taken into care and asked if my wife and I could take them for just a short period of time, we of course agreed. We didn't want to be the reason that they were placed into foster care. We both work, so we do okay financially, but taking care of 2 extra kids is a strain. Well, now it's 6 months later, and I'm just hearing about the financial options through TANF and licensing. The interview for TANF was 3 hours long. I don't know if licensing is worth the hassle because the social worker won't tell me how long we'll have these kids. So again, from the perspective of the relatives, they're feeling this really poor communication on DC-Web. How long are these kids going to be here? Those of us who know the system understand why there's not this definitive, timeline. But from their perspective, they're not sure if they should be taking all of these steps when they think maybe that this will just be resolved really quickly. Sometimes there's a delay in learning about resources. They get hit with a fire hose of stuff right off the bat. So it doesn't mean that it wasn't shared with them, but it often means that it wasn't really processed. And sometimes the state will perceive a little hesitancy, which the caregivers are expressing, and that just needs to be sorted out. Are they hesitant because they're not really wanting to have these kids? Or are they hesitant because they don't have enough information? But again, the communication and just the point of this is just the perspective of having to just have this new system thrown at you and making sure that we're all kind of just slowing down to recognize that they don't have the perspective and the knowledge and the practice that we do. So research shows that children removed from their parents fare better when placed with extended family over non-related foster parents. And Jeannie, I don't know if you had that resource to share. Again, the point of this and what she's going to put up is that this isn't just anecdotal. This isn't just the state's preference. This really is based on research and following kids and following what their outcomes are. So we'll talk more about that, but I just wanted to throw that out there. And that doesn't mean that you just plunk a kid with a relative and call it good. Obviously, there's going to be some basic vetting, but really, I think the point of our training today is children are going to have these better social and mental health outcomes, but it requires the families to have support. So we're going to teach you about what those supports are, and that's what's available for them. But if they don't have access to them or don't know about them, then that puts them definitely at a disadvantage, right? Okay, the next slide is what I'm hoping to hear from some of you. So I want us to consider the fact that there is bias against family that does exist, and that a lot of it is based on long-standing myths. So I would just challenge some of you, what are some myths that you have heard about families? Maybe why you shouldn't place kids with family. Anybody going to be brave enough?
I'll be brave.
Okay.
So these are the families that raised the parents who had their children taken away.
Right. Yep. Thank you. So what's the then assumption then that here, we'll just go to this one, right? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Are you thinking along that lines, or that perhaps they're the ones who also maybe did some damage to the parents?
Oh, good, both. You know, most of us learn parenting by example. So however we were parented, that's how we become parents. So if I made poor choices as a parent, that's probably because I'm parenting the same way my parent did. So Now, if my mother has to take care of my child because I cannot, she's
Mhm.
not going to do it any different than I do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. No, that's absolutely. Because it does fall into that, right? If a parent is unsafe, maybe they're learning, they're demonstrating learned behaviors, like you were saying, or there's this assumption sometimes might be conscious or not conscious that the family is partially responsible, right, for the trauma that this parent has experienced and led them to be who they were. There's also, I think, the bias and presumption that, well, the family must have known what was going on and they didn't intervene. They had to have suspected, or they had to have known, and they allowed this to happen. I think sometimes the other piece of that is there might be an observation of a similar level of poverty, and the assumption then transfers that, oh, well, if this home is lower income and the parent is, then all of the issues that are going on in that home must also be going in the relative home. And so there's this presumption that the child's going to be better off in a traditionally licensed foster home. So the reality is that kin really does provide unique protective factors for kiddos. And they, especially when we were talking about minimizing trauma, which was in that earlier quote, children are 3 to 4 times less likely to be maltreated than children in traditional foster homes. Does that surprise anyone? Okay, we'll keep going. Another one that I hear a lot, and I know Jeannie and Luann involvement in the legislature, is that it's their moral responsibility, right? So that's this myth that families should just do this. This myth gets tossed out a lot around in the legislature. And even one of our local to Southeastern Washington former senators was caught saying, it's really odd, families wouldn't take care of family without these financial supports. And so this biased opinion really translates to a reluctance, if not a refusal, to direct legislative funds to families not licensed to the child welfare system. And this is changing, and so this is really fantastic, but this has been a barrier for quite some time, where it just shows that people aren't acknowledging the sacrifices that relatives are making to rear children and their extended family, right? Because love and morals don't pay the bills, and we need to make sure that they're getting the supports that they need. Just some data from the USDA reports that the average family will spend $12,980 per child, and that was pre all of this big inflation. And so just again, thinking about, if great grandma Jean is living on a fixed income and now has this additional child in her home, that can be a big strain. And so regardless of if you think it's your moral responsibility, that's not going to help pay for the new shoes or the braces. Another myth that can be thrown out there has to do with kinship not being as stable. And again, I think that really just fits back into that earlier narrative of the apple not falling far from the tree, that if there's issues with the family, then that's going to extend out, or that if the family members need all of this additional financial support, then again, it's not as stable. So that's the myth. But the reality is that these homes are more stable. Children are less likely to re-enter foster care, and they experience fewer placement changes when they're in relative placement. Families tend to be more willing to stick through challenging behaviors. There is a greater likelihood that siblings will be placed together, and they do provide, those kinship caregivers do provide a higher level of permanency in the form of guardianship as well.
Katie,
Yes.
before you move, Nancy had her hand up while you were talking. I don't know if the comment is still relevant.
Thank you. I can't see everybody.
Oh, thank you. Um, so my question was, the other day I listened to Dee Wilson, and he talked about, and this was for the chronically neglected kids, but he talked about maybe we need to pay foster care, make professional foster care to take care of these kids. And now I heard you talk about, politicians don't want to pay, family, we'll put the money in professions. And is that an actual trend that's going on, as opposed to, I guess my personal belief is, are there ways that we can intervene with the family financially way before the children even are removed? Because $12,000 is a lot of money.
Yeah, and that was a pretty old, that was a report from 2015, which was the most recent number I could find from the USDA, right? So you pose an amazing question that I think we could probably spend a couple of hours on just in and of that. Jeannie, you have a little bit more of a beat, and Ryan, as well as some of the things that are being talked about. Do you want to chime in on that?
Sure, I can try. I mean, so we're coming up on ledge season. I mean, coming up, it's in January. January is just around the corner. This is a pretty big one where there's a lot of different packages put in to request more services for kinship caregivers. What I will tell you is, compared to other states, Washington's legislature is very kinship friendly, and is very open to creating programs that just simply encourage and foster kinship care. So that's the good news, but there's never enough money. So that's the bad news, right? So if they could give us unlimited dollars, we would be able to solve everything, but they won't. So we'll do the best with what they do give us.
And I'll just add too, Nancy, I mean, just thinking it from even a larger systems perspective, right? So we're probably always going to need like a cadre of foster parents, right? Just somebody that can take care of kids when we need them to. With Dee's approach in terms of like doing like a professionalized system, what I would really like to see that be is just kind of like, that's an interim foster care situation, right? Like just to get everyone stabilized. Maybe it's a couple of months. There's lots of visits going on, right? But you need that kind of intensive placement for kids. And then there's another layer where we could do relatives, where we could actually support the relatives a little bit better. Again, just to make sure everything's going on there. That's probably the next cheapest. But then I also think too, and this is kind of the global thing, Nancy, just to think about, if we're going to throw all of this money at people to take care of other people's kids, what would happen if we actually gave that money to the parents to take care of their own kids, rather than the only way that we can resource a kid is if we have to take them out of their home? What if we could give those resources to the parents and see what happens, and see if that's what fixes their parental deficiencies? But then you get into these issues of equity and like who gets what, and why should somebody get money to take care of their own kid? And that's where this whole thing starts to get really philosophical, but there you go. And I think that's why the politicians sometimes struggle, because there's all those different options and neither one of them is the best solution. And politicians love to only throw money at what they think will actually work and put all of their money in one basket rather than build out a comprehensive system. So
the other thing is there's a new legislative budget request going in for a 7-tier payment program for foster parents that includes respite and case aids and things that are not in the foster care system right now. And that's for both kinship and foster care. So if that passes, there'll be a lot of changes too with services that are provided to kids.
And just imagine if we could give those same services to parents. So I'll just stop there.
Great question, Nancy. Anyone else have a question? Okay, so now my turn to ask a question of all of you again, and would love to hear from you. So we've talked, I've talked a little bit about children thriving in kinship care, and like I said, beyond just these anecdotes and observations and hope, there really is evidence based on research to show this. So what I would love to hear from you is, what are some of the strengths and unique benefits of relative caregivers that come to mind? Why do you think it's important that we keep children in a kinship placement if possible?
But the children may know the grandma already, so there's familiarity. It's not going to a strange place. They may be going to a place that they know already and like. And
Yeah, thank you, Christine. That's fantastic.
They have a shared cultural background
Mhm.
and familial background, storytelling, history.
Right.
Connection to their past.
Yes. Yeah.
Katie, can you see the chat?
No, I can't.
Okay.
Yeah, I would love your help. Sorry, Luann.
Okay, so culture, Native
Mhm.
American children living with Native American families. They have a familiar surrounding and have access to many of other relatives. Familiarity and continuity. Relatives are more supportive of visits with parents and less traumatic for children.
Yeah, wonderful. So you guys hit it. I think just terrific ideas. And so here's my first one. It's almost like I had a plant, right? Kinship care is much more likely to result in these kiddos being placed with a family that matches, their other nuclear family along the lines of racial, religious, and cultural dimensions. It can definitely be a manner or a tool for reducing the racial disparities in the child welfare system. Obviously, that doesn't speak to the removal, but just in terms of how we're supporting our families moving forward. And like you were sharing, knowing where you come from and who your people are really results in this immeasurable positive impact. And again, that identification with a particular cultural background, that secure sense of cultural family identity, is associated with higher self-esteem, better educational attainment, and it is a protective factor against mental health problems, substance use, and other future issues. So it really does provide so much for our kiddos to have that connection. Another thing that I had mentioned previously, right, that placement stability. We talked about caregivers feeling more committed and more likely to care for a child despite some behavioral problems. As one of you shared, right, more willing to facilitate those visits with parents. And so that can provide stability for them. And oftentimes kids are more likely to remain in their same community, thus decreasing a disruption of a move to a traditional foster home. One of the things that really stood out to me with looking at the details of keeping families together is this connection to siblings, because relatives are more willing to take large sibling groups. I think a lot of us here, I know some of my advocates that are on, they're squeezing them into their tiny little apartments because boy, grandma or the great aunt really wants to keep everybody together, and they will do that. For children with 3 or more siblings, 54% of those sibling groups are placed together in kinship homes. Contrast that with traditional foster homes, and you see only about 1.8% of large sibling groups placed together. So we talked, I heard some folks also talking about the well-being, right? And this was where some of the studies that Jeannie had, in addition to that better behavioral and mental health outcomes, kids are having better scores in physical, cognitive, emotional, skill-based domains. Kids are sharing that they would be more likely to stick around into these relative placements. These older kids are less likely to run away. They're more likely to report wanting this kinship placement to be their permanent home. We're again more likely to see the process end in a guardianship. But what was interesting about some of the research that I read was that this has to happen at the onset of placement. So children who are moved first into a traditional stranger foster home and then much later moved into a kinship care placement, after a significant period of time, those behavioral problems and those outcomes, I'm trying to say this, they're more likely to have behavioral problems than those that are initially placed with their relatives. So again, the research showing that we need to get our kiddos in with relatives as quickly as possible. And that's a big piece of what DCYF is working on right now, is trying to reduce those barriers and try to really prioritize the placement of children with their kinship relatives. Safety, children and kinship homes are much lower risk for maltreatment, as I shared before, and then permanency. So there's going to be a greater likelihood of a guardianship, which will keep the family together, and the kids are less likely to re-enter foster care when they're cared for by relatives.
Katie, could I add something as well?
Please.
Okay. Having been an adoptive parent and a kinship care provider as well, there's something that I noticed with raising my nephew and then adopting my daughter is my nephew didn't have to go in search of his family history. It was already there. We kept that connection. He knew who his parents were. He, was part of that family already. So when he got older, he didn't go in search of family. Where my daughter, who was adopted, that was always a big question for her. Where do I come from? Who is my family? Who is my kin? That kind of thing. So I think kinship care really does alleviate them having to go in search of an identity when they get older, outside of the normal teenage stuff.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that, Luann. And I'm realizing this is the slide I didn't update. So my apologies. I think Jeannie was correcting me that nationally 1 in 19 children live in kinship care at some point in their life. Is that what you had said? Oh, I lost her. Yeah. And she's going to talk a lot more about this and the difference in the types of kinship. But what I am throwing this out there is just to share with you that nearly 3 million children across the country are in some form of kinship care, and the majority of them is occurring in an informal process outside of the child welfare system, which again, Jeannie's going to talk a little bit more about. But what I want us just to remember is that families are taking care of families in a lot of different ways, and some of that is safe and some of it needs some additional support. But when CPS and the state has to intervene, it also is just going to bring with it some bias and limitations that are inherent with this process. But families do this, and we want to be encouraging families to be taking care of each other. So you'll hear a little later a little bit more about who our kinship families are, but they are more likely to be lower income, single, older, less employed than families in which at least one parent is present. Can anyone think of why that would be? Who does it sound like we're describing here?
Grandparents?
Yeah, exactly. The grandparents, the great aunts, right? Living on a fixed income. Maybe they're still working, but they've downsized their home. And so again, we just need to be cognizant of getting them connected to all of these amazing supports provided by the state to help them have the resources that they need to care for these kiddos. 75%, we think roughly, of children in kinship care are living below the 2% of the federal poverty line. And the most updated numbers for this was here you see below. And again, from this angle, just sharing that, just because a family is poor does not mean they're unsafe. And we want to make sure that we're getting them the supports that they need so that they can care for their grandbabies and their great nieces and such. It can be hard for grand families to get help, and we'll go through some of those, but just really briefly, again, it's the circumstances alone of the child's removal can create some unique challenges. And thinking about just, the dynamic where grandma is now becoming the mom and having to negotiate supervising visits and what that is going to impact just that day-to-day of the family. The system is complicated and it's time consuming. it's a lot of stuff. And a lot of the times those of us who are more in the system take stuff for granted, and it's just so ingrained that we don't realize how hard or overwhelming it might be for other folks. And sometimes the supports are out of reach. And what I mean by that is depending on what rural community you live in, it can be a challenge if your nearest support is an hour drive. And so it's great hearing that DCYF has some new legislative packages out there. They're trying to really expand these services, but right now, sometimes these are a little challenging for our families. And we want to make sure that they get them, because again, I'll say this over and over again, but they need to have the support. If we're going to help them have these better outcomes, they need to have the available financial health services. Social mental health outcomes will improve when they get that, but they do need support. We're not just going to be throwing these kids that have been through trauma, that are struggling, and then not back up the grandparents. So I'm going to play a short little video. And this video is just a couple-minute clip about a family that where the mom, becomes the grandma, or the grandma becomes the mom, and how that impacted their family. So hopefully, give it just a sec.
When we got the call from the Children and Youth Agency that our 16-month-old grandson was going into care, my mind was trying to comprehend what was happening. Did our daughter really want us to have her son? Would this have a negative impact on our relationship? We definitely wanted him. We requested going through the agency that we have been foster parents with for 18 years because the trust and support they have given us. We have fostered and adopted 8 children, ages ranging 2 to 21 years old. Being a kinship parent is not exactly the same as being a foster parent. We feel a compassion for our daughter that is on a much deeper level than we've ever experienced before. Even though our children questioned their relationship to our new arrival, they accepted him with open arms. Should he still call them aunt and uncle? I tell them whatever he is comfortable with. It was quite an adjustment for our 2-year-old daughter, though. Here was another little person playing with her toys, wanting her mom to hold him. That is her spot. She stopped using her words and started grunting and pointing to express her needs for a few weeks. With encouragement and advice from our foster care specialist, we validated her feelings, and she has adjusted much better now, enjoying her role as older sister. I struggle with my dual role of being mother and grandmother. I don't want my daughter to have to endure more heartache when she hears her son call me the name he is supposed to call her. For now, we have become mommy and daddy. We will be whatever he needs. It is our privilege and responsibility to meet his needs, be his voice, and protect him. He does need a mommy and daddy to greet him each morning, care for him throughout the day, and to put him to bed at night. We have faith that whatever the outcome will be, our unconventional family will be blessed.
So I just wanted to throw up one of the policies here that shows, it isn't just our knowledge that families are valuable, and our knowledge that the research shows this. This has been accepted as policy, and it really is important that we prioritize our families. So again, why should we be prioritizing? Well, we've talked about the benefits, reflects our current values, and it's also part of both federal law and state law. So the federal law does require states to, quote, consider giving preference to an adult relative over a non-related caregiver when determining placement for a child. And the policy and the laws are really prioritizing that in Washington state. And I think we are really, I don't know if unique is the right word, but we're definitely forward thinking in Washington state about how much prioritization we go to putting our kiddos in kinship caregivers homes and with suitable others. So now is when I like to just take a second and just a step back for us to consider the historical practices of separating families, because this is part of our nation's history of placing children into non-biologically related families, and this dates way back into the colonial times. And I think we would all agree that these placements and placement decisions were not made in the child's best interests. And a lot of these practices were a form of indentured servitude, right? So the child was not welcomed as a member of the family as much as they were given maybe a place to sleep in exchange for their hard work. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the orphan trains. Those started back in New York City and ran for about 70 years. And they took orphans and poor children, primarily Catholic and recent immigrant children, and sent them by train out west to predominantly Protestant families. And again, they were often treated as indentured servants. Sometimes the cute little ones were welcomed into the home as a child, and other times it was a man who had lost his wife and was looking for a young woman to help raise the children, or some young boys to help out in the fields. At the same time, that was the start of the creation of the Native American boarding schools. And hopefully everybody here has heard and knows a little bit about that. And that was when there was the coerced and forced placement of Native American children into these schools with the goal of assimilating them into white culture and stripping them of their own. Prior to the 1980s, formal placement with relatives under the child welfare system was really not utilized and almost even unheard of. And it wasn't until 1997 that guardianship was formally recognized as a permanency option. So here we are, not really far out from when we as a country and as a system were consciously separating children from their families of origin. And now Washington is working really hard to change those priorities and refocus on keeping families together. There are 29 federally recognized tribes throughout our state of Washington. Nationwide, American Indian and Native Alaska children are overrepresented at a rate 2.7 times greater than their proportion of the population. So what that means is that American Indian and Native Alaskan children make up 0.9% of kids in the US, but they are 2.1% of all of the children placed into foster care. Contrasting that with Caucasian and white children, their underrepresentation, so again, underrepresentation 0.8 times lower than their proportion to the population. While they make up 52% of the children in the US, they are only 42% of the children placed in foster care. So again, I sidetrack just to make sure that it's all really, really out there, what the discrepancies are here. So under federal law, and I'm not sure if any of you took the ICWA class, hopefully you did, an Indian child must be placed in the least restrictive setting where their needs can be met. That is also in reasonable proximity to their home. Again, we just talked about the large number of tribes in our own home state, and you can see here just how few of them are actually placed with Indian caregivers. That doesn't mean the law doesn't say that's not the way it's supposed to be, but we just all need to do some stronger efforts. So the Indian Child Welfare Act does also have a specific order of preference in the type of placements for Indian children, unless there's a good place or a good cause to place them somewhere else. And so those are also written into Washington state. The first priority, of course, would be a member of the child's extended family. Next would be a foster home that's licensed, approved, or specified by the child's tribe. An Indian foster home that's licensed or approved by the state. And then towards the bottom would be an institution for children approved by an Indian tribe if there were special needs that needed to be addressed. So as the last resort. And I think when thinking about not only our American Indian children, but all of our children in care, when we're thinking about placement, you know, really need to be thinking about that long-term view, right? We're not just talking about what's immediate might be better for them now, thinking about keeping those family connections, thinking about keeping those cultural connections and the value of that in that long-term of knowing who they are and where they come from. So now I've asked you about some of the positives and the benefits. I would just ask to see what, you know, thinking about what some of the unique challenges are and barriers to meeting the needs of children and kinship families. And I'm just going to kind of run through these as you are thinking, just to get us moving along. But there, you know, it's definitely unique for some of the experiences that our relatives have. You know, complicated family dynamics, right? Like thinking about even in just in the example from the video, right, where she's, what do we call that? You know, are we going to be called mom? Am I called grandma? Am I the niece? What is going on in the family? Is there some guilt about the situation? Is there fear? How is the parent thinking about the grandparent who's raising their child? So those are a dynamic that doesn't exist in our traditional foster placements. Again, they're navigating a complex system during a time of crisis. So again, instead of having to do that prior, traditional foster parents at their convenience and when they're in a good spot can navigate that complex system, but our relative caregivers are doing it when, you know, this trauma has been happening and there's this crisis with their family. And so that adds to just how challenging it can be to get through the system. We've heard from some of our relatives that they're afraid if they ask for help that the child will be removed. That's not accurate, but again, just considering where they're coming from and not understanding how everything works, that can be just a specific challenge that they experience. The lack of resources and barriers to receiving many resources. Again, you're going to hear about a ton, and this is really improving. So this is fantastic that they're out there. Again, sometimes just being in really rural and remote communities, or we talked about, you know, if we had all the money in the world from the legislature, we could do a whole lot more, but sometimes getting access to things can be difficult for them. And the licensing rules were originally designed for non-relative foster families. And so some of the requirements don't necessarily make sense. And so Washington State has been taking a look at some of those rules and trying to ease the restrictions that don't apply to our relative caregivers. This slide I borrowed from American Bar Association presentation, and I won't read through all of them, but I think it's important just to consider the perspective of both the traditional foster families and the kinship families. You know, traditional foster families are making a decision well in advance. They've got time to plan. They don't have to insert themselves into the complicated family dynamics. You know, they can often approach it feeling like they're saving the child, and this can be a really big celebration. And our kinship families, it's a lot more complicated, right? Because there are family dynamics and there's a lot of mixed feelings about what's going on with the parent of the children that's in their home. And maybe they really loved being grandma. They're not so sure about being the parent for that period of time. So I want to just talk briefly about some of the licensing piece. Again, I'm not the DCYF guru on this, so I want to try and keep it really high level, I guess. But from the perspective of an advocate, I think it's helpful for you to just understand a little bit about some of what licensing can be like and what all of the different complexities are. But I will ask you to save any detailed questions on that for Jeannie and Luann, because she's going to have a lot better answer for you. So a lot of the licensing boils down to getting federal reimbursement to the state, right? Everything costs a lot of money. And these are the basic federal licensing requirements. So at the federal level, you can see that their caregiver needs to be 18 years old. They have to complete a background check, have that basic home assessment, And while it doesn't specifically use the word training, it does speak to that certification of appropriate knowledge and skills to provide for the needs of the child. And so each state has some flexibility beyond these to create licensing standards that best fit that state's priorities and cultures. And I share this just because I want everyone to understand there's no, just like there's no legal definition of best interest, licensing standards can also vary a little bit state by state. However, all of them have to, at the very minimum, meet these basic licensing requirements. So I dig Legos and I'm a visual learner. And so I grabbed this graphic from DCYF just to really briefly hit on the different tiers. And this is changing a lot. So that yellow one up top should say guardianship as well, because we're definitely pushing for that a lot more here in Washington State. And Washington State is one of many states, but not all states allow the DCYF to place children in kinship homes with an unlicensed relative. So again, each state gets to have some discretion in how they are managing their placement. And so we're fortunate to have that here in Washington State. So that basic safety assessment, that red block would be the basic home study. It's an emergent placement. Grandma Jean still has to pass some basic safety standards to make sure that this, that the child can be put in there. But we can place the child faster than in other states that would require her to be licensed first. So that emergent placement standard right now just applies again, like it says, if it's an emergent. This is not to get into the weeds or to overcomplicate things, but I have found that a lot of times our advocates and the relatives get a little confused on all of the different steps. So I just wanted to quickly put these out there to help include those in your vernacular, maybe a basic understanding. So let's say there was an emergent placement, it's right at shelter care, Grandma Jean has placement of her kiddos, she's still going to have to go through a home study, which here is written as a well-being assessment. And so the child could be allowed to stay in Grandma Jean's home, having passed the basic background check and walk through the home and that home study or well-being assessment. And that relative could choose not to get a license, and maybe they don't want to move forward with adoption. The one below that would be a relative who does want to pursue licensing, so that would be another layer, and then another step that they could take would be adding that green Lego. We have some relatives that want to adopt but don't get licensed, so they do, again, that initial home study, but the time that the child is with them, they don't go through licensing, and that's acceptable too, again, as I shared for Washington State. And then the fourth tier would be for relatives who do want a license, and that would then help them, as you'll learn more, be able to receive supports as a guardian, or they may then go into adoption. So there's lots of different ways that you can construct some of these Legos, but we're always going to have the well-being and safety assessment. So this I just throw out just to have you consider, thinking about these Legos that I had, some of the barriers that are being addressed currently, and so we'll see some big changes in the coming year, really go back to that model of the licensing standards were created for non-relatives. And so we can have that initial home study and placement, and grandma can be approved to have the kiddos in her house. But maybe because the apartment's too small and there are kids sharing a bedroom, she's not going to be approved for licensing. And the concept there that I'm just wanting you to consider is, again, is that really a safety issue, so that we're maybe advocating for grandma and looking at different ways to keep the kiddos in their placement if that's what needs to happen. We shouldn't have families being split up because they can't all fit in a certain space. So it can be a little bit of a challenge. And again, and this is pretty vague, so I apologize if that's making it a little bit more complicated. But again, with these Legos, right, we can do just this where they're, they're not getting licensed, they don't want to adopt, but they've still been deemed safe enough to have the placement there, or they can go straight to adoption. But we want to also be supporting those relatives that aren't able to get licensed. And so that's what this new legislation that Jeannie's been working on will do. There are just a few, barriers for relatives as well. The training and paperwork is time consuming. So fortunately, there's been some changes that will decrease the amount of training requirements for kinship caregivers and will allow them to do some more stuff online. But as someone who went through it themselves, it's pages and pages and pages, and it can be a lot to try and squeeze in 24 hours of training when you're working and when you have children in the home. Sometimes they just don't understand the paperwork or the value of the benefit from licensing. That's why you'll get to learn about some of the amazing programs that are out there now to help them navigate this so that they aren't having to do it by themselves. The application can be intrusive. So sometimes families just don't want to have to share all of that information about their previous relationships and how they parent and any trauma that they went through. They have to have a health assessment from a primary care doctor. Again, if you don't have insurance and you're trying to work, that can be a challenge to knock out. Again, if your home doesn't meet the specific standards, they might meet that standard to have the child placed there, but not enough to be licensed. And licensing can get expensive. Sometimes there are fees, if you need to have the water in your well tested or get your vaccinations for all of your pets, and that can add up. And like I said, from very beginning with great uncle Jared, sometimes relatives just think that this is going to be short term, and so they don't get started on it, not realizing that this could actually take a lot longer. Some of the other bureaucratic barriers, criminal history or someone in the home. There's a long list of specific disqualifiers, and so sometimes, of course, we really want there to be some barriers, right? Barriers aren't always bad, but sometimes there might be something that would not be considered a safety risk at this point, or it could be argued, but that still becomes a barrier. There is also the barrier of any previous child abuse and neglect findings, and also character and suitability. And Jeannie, feel free to jump in here. As she was explaining, one of those two things alone is not enough to be a barrier. So again, we want to be placing children in homes that is going to be good for them and that is going to meet their needs. But we want to make sure we're not excluding family based on maybe something that happened 30 years ago. Social workers are expected, the law says the judges should be holding our social workers accountable for pursuing other avenues. It just doesn't always happen. But again, we're hoping that that will start to be a more regular occurrence. And then stranger foster care is just easier. And that's, again, when you're thinking about all of the work and all of the effort that goes into finding the kinship and getting it screened, it's a lot of time. And when folks are really under resourced, it's just easier to place them with somebody who's already been through that licensing.
Katie, could I ask a question really fast?
Oh, yes, please.
So I, in addition to volunteering as a child advocate, I also work doing adoption home studies and home studies for guardianship. And I have I'm very privileged to be, I'm learning from a woman who's been doing that for like over 30 years. And she's very, very knowledgeable because of her experience. She's worked across states, et cetera. Right. But some of the stuff that you were just talking about, as far as barriers are concerned, are things that she talks about all the time. That, when she's doing really in-depth home studies with families with lots of background, like those barriers, like previous issues with drug abuse, et cetera. she's often the one who has to advocate for why that relative placement is a suitable placement, and feels like she gets a lot of the pushback from people in, I guess, the bureaucracies. But she knows that other home study preparers are like not on the same page as her. So I am curious about how we are making sure that private home study preparers are getting on board with some of the same stuff. Because it's, I think we would look at that whole systems overview. It's great if DCYF is doing this, and it's great if juvenile justice is doing this, but if we're not actually making sure that there's that communication happening with the home study preparers so that they're on the same page in approving a home placement, then I think we're missing a really key piece there. So is there an effort to make sure that those private home study preparers are on the same page about all of these changes that are going on too?
Yeah, boy, that is a wonderful question, and thank you for adding that, because like you said, there is what the law says and what the policies are in the practice, and it's just not always being put into practice. Jeannie or Luann or Ryan, are you able to better answer that question? I don't interact really with the private licensing agencies.
I'll also say I don't really interact with the private licensing agencies very often either. Ryan?
Did we lose Ryan?
No, I'm here. I got nothing. I can find out, but I got nothing.
And I would say that the child placement agencies are on board with the same standards as DCYF, but it would be those that are writing private home studies that aren't connected necessarily with a CPA that would not be getting the information.
Yeah, and I think with the state agencies, some of what I have seen, it kind of blends that with the foster care is easier. We've had cases where, like you were sharing, there maybe were some really old drug charges that still pop up, and it just takes a few extra steps to sort through that and explain why we would think that it was still safe for that child based on the specific circumstances and based on the child's age. Maybe if they're older teen and they've been running away, and so this is going to be the best placement for them. And sometimes with just a lack of local agency resources, we've just seen it just goes to what's easier. So again, the system isn't perfect, and my goal is for you to just expand your knowledge so that you can just be asking these questions. If you see something come up and you believe that maybe it can be safe, then just be asking those questions and talking with the social worker.
And Katie, Skylar would like to know, where is character and suitability defined?
Ooh.
Off of your slide.
Yeah, Jeannie, do you want to help me with the exact definition, since that's a DCYF thing, when it's looking a little bit at just kind of the overall background of that person?
You find character and suitability mentioned in the shelter care RCWs. Off the top of my head, I do not know the exact one, but it is in the shelter care ones.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm not sure that there's a complete definition of that, if that was the question, but that is, some of the language used to be looking at the family members. And I think that's, again, adds to some challenges, right? Is if there's some wiggle room, just like there's not a legal definition of best interest, their character and suitability leaves some room for interpretation. So the good news
add
is
something, Katie.
Oh, heck yeah.
So advocates, if you're running up against where you think where the character and suitability issue is coming up or being used as a reason to deny a potential placement, and you're like, and you've checked it out and you think everything's okay, feel free to push back on that character and suitability as a reason for not allowing the placement. We get those all the time, and we take those to court, and we make those recommendations. So if you're thinking, I don't understand what this character and suitability pieces is, talk to your program coordinator about maybe we need to file a motion, or maybe we need to kind of overrule the department's policy because a lot of this too, I'm not aware of the character and suitability issue in statute, but I am aware of it in policy. And so sometimes, remember, we don't have to follow DCYF policy, right? The courts don't have to follow DCYF policy. We have to follow the law. So that is one of those things. If you're running into a situation where you're like, I don't see what the problem is, that charge was 20 years ago, talk to your coordinator so that we can get that motion filed and get that placement done through the court. There are other ramifications to that, and I know DCYF doesn't like that. I beg your pardon, Jeannie and Luann, but that's our separate roles. So that's what we do. So
All good, Ryan.
thank you, Jeannie.
Thank you, Ryan. And again, great question. And so wrapping up kind of my end, I do just want to again point out there are non-safety exemptions allowed under, this is the federal law that permits this. And then I just want to share with you what some of the ones are that are allowed under Washington state law. And again, there's been a lot of work at the state level from different folks in the agency, Ryan and Jeannie, and so many others, trying to make it easier for relatives to be licensed and to get that financial support. These are some of the exemptions that are allowed. Again, like Ryan said, there are ramifications for, and some consequences when you go for waivers, but sometimes this can be really important and necessary. So that second one, applicants must be 18 years of age. So that has changed in Washington for our kinship caregivers, right? Because that earlier slide where I said the federal requirement, they just have to be 18. In Washington state, if you're a licensed foster care traditional foster parent, you need to be 21, but they've lowered that. They've made this exception for relatives to be 19. The bedroom requirements, that's one that we see come up again. Grandma has a bunch of the siblings, they're all sharing a bedroom, they're mixed gender. That's fine for that home study. But again, the licensing requirements were designed for non-related families. So once kids hit a certain age, they can't be in the same bedroom together. And so now grandma's faced with, I have them, we've been doing this is fine, but this is going to be the only barrier to me getting licensing and that financial support. So it does allow for there to be some exemptions, and hopefully in the next year or so, we'll see real specific language that will make that easier and not have so much of an issue. And I do want to actually, sorry, go back really fast. I did add homeschooling because this is technically in the list of exemptions, but this is almost never approved. It literally requires the approval of Ross Hunter, who is the secretary of DCYF. So it's pretty much not going to happen, but it is written in that WAC. So I wanted to add it. Okay, so you're going to hear next. I'm almost done talking about ways to support relatives, but you as advocates, some of the things that you can do, just remember that they are going to have, these kinship caregivers have adverse experiences of their own. They're going through a lot of grief and loss. There a lot of times it can be really isolating from their own peers, because now all of a sudden they've got 5 little kids at home and their friends are living in retirement. Ask them what they need frequently. Try to reduce the barrier of them having to come to you or come to the social worker all of the time, and just lend them an ear. I find a lot of my advocates can just do this great job of just listening, just taking that half an hour to listen to the caregiver, because ultimately that can often be what keeps that placement intact, is if they just have a safe person that they can kind of unload on. So I'm not saying be their therapist or their counselor, but just letting them vent if they need to, or just talk about how hard things are, because again, they're pretty isolated in this new role. So just be kind, be patient and empathetic. And I think there was a whole 3-hour block yesterday on legislative changes and what's coming, or maybe that was on the funding request, but there's a lot coming up. So what's really great is Washington State really is prioritizing putting kinship caregivers at the top of the list for placement and supporting them. And so these are just a couple of the things that will be changing and have changed. And I will leave you with this quote from Dr. Perry, who wrote "The boy who is raised as a dog and born for love. The more healthy relationship a child has, the more likely he will recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love." And with that, I thank you, and we'll pass this over to Jeannie. Once I stop sharing my
That was
slide.
a wonderful presentation, Katie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.